Something just happened in Washington that tells you everything about who actually holds the power in this trade fight, and it's not who you think. For weeks, American negotiators have been laying out exactly what they want from Canada. For weeks, Canadian officials have been sitting across the table, listening, pushing back, and buying time. But this week, that changed. President Trump was direct. Canada is nasty. They are. They're nasty. People think Canada, they're nasty. People, I love the people, but they're nasty. Nasty leadership. 6 days before Donald Trump's 50% tariffs are set to hit, Canada looked at what was on offer and said, "It isn't good enough." And if you're watching from Toronto, Calgary, Montreal, or anywhere in between, this is a story that touches your wallet, whether you realize it yet or not. Here's what's really going on. Over the past few weeks, American negotiators arrived in Washington with a list, not a request, a list. 9 demands, all aimed at one country. Drop the retaliatory tariffs Canada put in place earlier this year. Put American alcohol back on provincial liquor store shelves. Loosen the dairy quota system that's protected Canadian farmers for decades. And on top of all of it, hand over preferential access to Canada's critical minerals, energy, and security partnerships, the very resources America's own economy is increasingly leaning on. Canadian officials have remained in Washington through all of this, working against a self-imposed goal of presenting a deal to the president by early next week. As of right now, they're not there, and the numbers attached to failure are not small. Roughly $28 billion in Canadian exports sit on the other side of this deadline, exposed to tariffs that would land automatically if no agreement is reached. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. This is the same trade deal, USMCA, that Donald Trump signed himself in his first term. He called it his signature achievement on trade. He bragged about it publicly, repeatedly, as proof he could out-negotiate anyone. 6 years later, with that deal up for renewal, he's the one who chose not to extend it, reaching instead for Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law so old and so rarely used that no American president in modern history had ever applied it at this scale. A trade analyst watching this unfold put it plainly. Canada is a relatively small problem that this administration seems unusually obsessed with. That obsession matters because underneath the noise, a very simple question is being asked right now in boardrooms, farmhouses, and kitchen tables across this country. Does Canada actually need the United States to survive, the way Washington keeps insisting? Or is it the other way around? But wait, let's look at this from a different angle. Here's what the numbers actually show. Canada is the #1 export customer for nearly 40 of the 50 American states. Americans sell more to Canada than they sell to the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan combined. Add to that a growing set of trade relationships with Europe and the Indo-Pacific, the lowest debt load in the G7, recent job growth numbers that outperformed expectations, and a foreign investment pattern that's been building steadily for nearly 2 years. And a very different picture starts to emerge. One where Canada is negotiating from a position most Canadians probably don't realize it's in. One veteran trade negotiator, someone who sat across the table from Washington for decades, put it simply, the goal was never to hand the Americans a symbolic win at Canada's expense. In past rounds of negotiation, the same pattern has played out again and again. The United States walks away with the headline, the bragging rights, the "We beat Canada" story for the cameras, while Canada quietly walks away with the actual trade volume, the actual market access, the actual cash. Let them have the trophy. Canada takes the outcome. That's not naive optimism. That's a strategy that's worked before, and it's the same playbook being run right now. Now let's break down, piece by piece, what's actually being asked for. Start with dairy, since it's the demand generating the loudest headlines. Canada's supply management system already allows American producers to export a fixed quota into Canada completely tariff-free. It's only once that quota is exceeded that tariffs climb sharply, in some cases as high as 200%. On its own, that number sounds outrageous, exactly the kind of figure a White House podium loves to repeat. But here's what consistently gets left out of that talking point. American producers have never once filled that quota. Not once. In all the years since it was negotiated. Which means the outrageous tariff being used to justify this entire fight is, in practical terms, a number nobody has ever actually had to pay. Then there's alcohol. Provincial liquor boards across the country already pulled American products off their shelves in earlier rounds of this dispute. A visible, everyday reminder to ordinary Canadians of exactly where things stand between the two countries. Reversing that isn't a minor technical concession. It's asking Canada to publicly back down in the one place shoppers actually see this fight play out with their own eyes every time they walk down a liquor store aisle. Then there's the demand that may end up mattering more than any other in the long run. Critical minerals and energy. Washington wants preferential access locked into any new agreement, but those resources aren't a favor Canada owes its neighbor. They're leverage, genuine structural leverage. Inputs. The American economy needs to stay competitive at exactly the moment the rest of the world is racing to secure supply chains outside of unstable or adversarial regions. Handing that access away without getting something significant in return would mean giving up one of the only cards Canada actually holds. Now, put the math next to the rhetoric because the numbers tell a very different story than the one coming out of Washington. Tariffs are paid by the country that imposes them. When new duties land on Canadian goods entering the United States, it isn't Ottawa writing that check. It's American importers absorbing the cost first, and American consumers absorbing it next. At the checkout counter, on grocery bills, on hardware store receipts, on the sticker price of a new vehicle. For a country already fighting its own affordability crisis, that's not a footnote buried in a trade brief. That's the real price of this fight, and it isn't landing where the headlines suggest. Let's zoom out for a moment because context matters here. This dispute isn't happening in isolation. It's the latest chapter in what's genuinely the most integrated trading relationship on Earth. Car parts crossing the border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished. Cattle raised in one country, processed in the other. Energy and minerals flowing south while manufactured goods flow north. For decades, that relationship ran almost like plumbing. Invisible. Assumed. Something nobody in either country had to think twice about. What this moment reveals is that none of it was ever guaranteed. It was built through deliberate decisions made by real people at real negotiating tables, and it can be unmade the same way. One 96-year-old law and one signature at a time. So where does this actually leave ordinary Canadians in the days ahead? First, expect noise. Expect headlines swinging between cautious optimism and stark warnings, sometimes within the same 24 hours, because both governments have every incentive to project strength publicly while continuing to talk privately behind closed doors. Second, expect real economic effects regardless of how the politics ultimately resolve. Even the uncertainty itself carries a cost. Businesses delaying investment decisions, exporters quietly hedging by courting buyers overseas, families holding off on big purchases until the picture clears. That uncertainty doesn't vanish the moment a deal gets signed. It lingers for months, sometimes years, shaping decisions long after the headlines move on. And third, expect this fight to keep shaping how Canada thinks about its future well past whatever happens with this specific deadline. Whatever the outcome, the lesson has already landed in Ottawa and in provincial capitals across the country. Relying this heavily on a single trading partner, no matter how close, no matter how historically reliable, is a risk Canada can no longer afford to treat as unavoidable. 6 days remain before these tariffs are scheduled to take effect. Whatever happens next, one thing has already shifted in this fight, and it isn't a small thing. Canada didn't blink first. It walked away from an offer instead of accepting it just to make the pressure stop. And that alone may be the story Washington didn't expect to be telling right now. The Prime Minister has already signaled that retaliation is back on the table and has asked the premiers to bring forward their own options for hitting back. And Canadian officials have told their American counterparts plainly, miss this deadline, and Canadians may not have the appetite to keep talking at all. So mark that deadline. It isn't just a line in a trade brief somewhere in Ottawa, it's the moment that could determine grocery prices, dairy quotas, and the shape of the Canada-US relationship for years to come. Because right now, Canada is negotiating like a country that finally understands the leverage it's been sitting on the whole time. Washington wanted a quick yes, and 6 days out, Canada still hasn't given them one. Stay with us because this story is far from over.